This week on the Midlife Awareness Podcast.
What is life? What does that mean to be a living thing? Because I don't think we can understand these big questions of free will without understanding what it means to be a living thing. I think we have to ground the concepts I referred to earlier of purpose and meaning and value at that level.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Midlife Awareness Podcast. We have a special edition for you today. We are going outside of the United States. We're going to talk with Kevin Mitchell, Free Agent. How Evolution Gave Us Free Will is his latest book. He comes from a neuroscience background. And Kevin Mitchell, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Dennis, thanks a lot for having me.
So Kevin Mitchell comes from us from Dublin, Ireland. And so Kevin, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody, what your background is, and what some of the reasons on why you wrote this book. I have to say on the outset, this was a very, very good book. I loved your angle. We're talking about free will today. Normally we talk about free will from a religious standpoint, but it was refreshing to see something from a science or a biological background. And so why don't we get into why you wrote the book, kind of, where your emphasis is on your, what you do and education and all that.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I am Associate Professor of Genetics and Neuroscience at Trinity College in Dublin. I actually grew up in the States near Philadelphia and then moved to Ireland with my family. I did my undergrad in Ireland, but then postgrad and other work in California for a decade. So I've been back and forth between the States and Ireland quite a lot. And my interest really started with how the brain develops. So how does the brain get put together in an embryo? As an embryo is growing, all the different cells in the brain have to be made, but then they have to connect to each other. And that's based on some instructions in the genome for how to do that. So I became really interested in how that happens generally, but also how it can lead to variation between people in the way that their brain is formed, which can then manifest in sort of their personality traits and lots of other psychological things about them. And so one of the interesting things, if you're thinking about personality traits, is really they're about how we make decisions. So people might vary, for example, in how risk averse they are. And that we'll call that a personality trait, but really it manifests when we go to make a decision. And you and I might have different sort of degrees of risk aversion, and therefore we might decide to do something differently in a given circumstance. And so my previous book, which came out in 2018, was called Innate, and it was about how the wiring of our brain shapes who we are. And I would often get when I talked about that book, I would often get questions from people who would say, well, you're saying that we're not blank slates, that our genetics and the way our brain develops really influences our behavior. And I think that's right. That's absolutely right. But the question would be, well, what does that mean for free will? Am I really in charge if my behavior is constrained in that way by the way my brain is wired? And so that became a really interesting question, and I couldn't let it go. It bothered me about it because it is, it's a real challenge to the question of freedom. And at the same time, there was another challenge, which was just coming from neuroscience in general. So we're learning more and more, huge amounts, about how different circuits in the brain mediate different kinds of behaviors, both in animals and in humans, to the point where we can see the cogs turning, and we can get in and intervene in them in animals, sometimes even in humans. We can manipulate decision making, we can manipulate behavior, control it even in animals in ways that make it seem like it's all one big mechanism, right? And I think a lot of neuroscientists, and some very prominently and outspokenly, think that, right? So they think of the brain as a big, big, complicated cybernetic system.
Right.
That's just a machine. And it's sort of this idea of just driving neural activity that pushes the organism around. And that also bothered me because I don't think that's the right view. I think the organism itself still has causal power as a whole entity. I think what neuroscience is revealing is the mechanisms that the organism uses to make decisions. It's not that the mechanisms are making the decision and the organism is just being carried along for the ride. But those are quite divergent kind of outlooks on what we're learning from neuroscience and genetics. And so what I wanted to do in this new book was consider those kind of challenges to the idea of free will, and even deeper ones from physics, for example, that everything is just made of atoms and the atoms are going to obey the laws of physics. What does it matter what you're thinking, right? How could that possibly push atoms around? So that's a even harder problem, not just for free will in humans, but for agency of any kind in any
Right.
organism. And so what I wanted to do then in the book was consider those problems, both from a philosophical point of view, but also grounded in the biology. And so I wanted to see the philosophical question usually is how, in principle, could it be that an organism could have free will? How could that happen, right? Given these sorts of challenges. And what I wanted to do was say, okay, yeah, those are good questions to have, but let's just look how it actually happened in practice. How do organisms actually make decisions? What systems do they use to do that? How much causal autonomy and power does that give to an organism as a whole? And so trust try to answer the questions in practice. Say, well, let's see, how did nature build it? And then maybe along the way, these big metaphysical mysteries will be, we can ground them a bit more, naturalize the discussion. And that's what I was trying to do.
This book was really cool the way it was set up, in the fact that it almost seemed like it was a set of train tracks. You had two different ideas. One, you go through the biological or evolutionary side on one train track, and then you have the philosophy side on the other train track. And I loved how throughout the book, you would kind of mesh them back and forth, but it always seemed like there was a little bit of a tension there. Is that the way you intended to send this book up, or did that just happen?
Yeah, I mean, the strategy I took, I guess, was first of all the idea of taking an evolutionary strategy. The reason for that is that I think of free will as reflecting. When we talk about free will, what are we talking about? What's the phenomenon?
Right.
It's that we seem to make decisions, right? As we go about our daily lives, we seem to do things, we act, we seem to be in control most of the time, and we're doing things for reasons that we can even talk about, right? So it seems like we're in control of our decisions, and yet there's lots of sort of philosophical challenges to the idea that we could be. So, and they get all tied up in humans with other really complicated things, like what does that mean for moral or legal responsibility? Where does consciousness come in? Where does culture come in? All these very human specific extra things. And what I wanted to do by taking an evolutionary approach is kind of just delay engaging with those other complex things and just say, well, wait a minute, how could any organism do anything? Right? How could
Right.
it be that a bacterium or an amoeba or a little worm is in control of what it does in the environment? That it's not just pushed around by things, it's not just pushed around by its own parts either. And so that was why I wanted to take an evolutionary approach to kind of ground some ideas that we need to naturalize in a scientific way that usually are kind of outside the scope of science. And those are things like purpose and meaning and value. Those are core concepts that we need to understand and think about free will in a clear way that doesn't get too kind of vague and mystical sounding, right? And I think that we can scientifically ground those concepts by thinking, what does it even mean to be a living organism?
Right.
What does that entail? What does it have to do to keep being a living organism through time? So that's why I had that one of your train tracks, the evolutionary track, and so at the start of the book, I set up these sort of philosophical challenges or the challenges from various sciences, neuroscience, genetics, physics, whatever. But I delay sort of going back to them till about halfway through the book because I want people to get a sense of a fairly, I think, clear scientific view of how basic organisms, simple organisms, can control their behavior. and then go back to these challenges and say, well, wait a minute, how does this view meet those challenges, or where can they talk to each other? And so there is a tension, you're right. And what I hope is that by the end of the book, that tension is resolved and that we can see a clear-eyed way to thinking about how living organisms control their behavior, including humans. And I guess part of the work that was done was to try and realize or uncover what it is about some of the philosophical positions that gets us into such trouble, right?
Yeah.
That we might have to kind of clear some of that brush out of the way in our minds, right? There's some sort of ways of thinking philosophically that once you start down that road, you're just lost,
Right.
right? There's just
Right.
no getting back to it. And so I guess some of the sort of philosophical work is trying to expose those ways of thinking and reveal and say, well, here's a different way of thinking about it, more consistent with the scientific view, that hopefully gets us where we need to be.
We are talking with Kevin Mitchell in his book, Free Agents: How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. Yes. And if you are a person that loves words like multiple realizability and things like that, you're going to love this book. I've never seen a book that just goes so deep um, in the science background of something. So I think that there's a little bit for everybody here. If you're someone who's really into that science background and who just really loves, um, how things develop from a single cell organism and on up, then everything is there. And then there's the philosophy side. So I really enjoyed the tension there. I come from more of a philosophical background, but
Mhm.
um, also then opening of the book, you have a story about a video game.
Yeah,
You call it um, Player One.
yeah,
And so that from the very beginning of the book, it sets up this tension between, okay, you got a person here playing a video game. The person that is playing the video game has these decisions to go along in the game. Okay, I want you to go through a little bit about that. But on
yeah,
the outside of that, you're playing a game with a computer. And inside that computer are all these pre-programmed responses.
yes.
Okay, so can you go through that part of it? And I thought that this was really a dynamic way to set this book
Yeah,
off.
yeah. Thanks. It was funny. So I mean, it's a true story in how this idea came to me, which is that I was literally watching my son playing this game. It's one of those games where you're in a world, you walk through, you meet people, and you have these like a list comes up of choices, things you can say or things you can do. Like it's an adventure game, and he was making choices as he went through this game, right? And he had reasons for doing that. He wanted, he had goals. He had knowledge about what was in the world. He had objectives, and he, was picking these from these options in order to try and achieve those. And that's what we do all the time. That's what all organisms do as they behave in the world. And what was interesting is that there were also in the game, so he was player one, but there were also in the game non-player characters, NPCs, right? And they seem to be entities, and they say things and they do things. It seems like they're sort of behaving as well, but of course they're not, right? They're literally just carrying out their pre-programming in the computer. And so there was a contrast, right? This contrast between him as a real agent and them as only as if agents. They only seem like they're agents. But then the worry comes up, right? Well, wait a minute. Like, are we really in that control though? I mean, maybe we also are just acting out the pre-programming. In this case, it's genetic pre-programming. It's the way our brain is configured at any moment, which is the consequence of the way it developed, of all the experiences that we've had, and so on. But maybe at any moment, we're no more in control than one of these NPCs. Maybe we just have these responses, and we're just reacting to what happens. We're not really planning or anything. And so that's a sort of a discomforting thought, right? And that's the idea that I referred to earlier from genetics, from neuroscience, that effectively we're robots. right? We're just meat puppets. And the way that we're configured is just driving what happens. And it doesn't it doesn't leave any room for us as persons, right, as selves, to be doing anything. The idea there is that all the work, all the causes of what happens are down at the level of neurons firing, right? It's neural circuits driving each other that determines the motor movements that I'm doing, for example, including the words, the motor movements to make these words. And yeah, that just doesn't seem right to me, but it also is not obvious how to escape from that. It's not obvious how to get to the point where the whole entity can have causal power over what's happening inside it. That just seems like a conundrum, right? And it is, right? It's a
Right.
reason why this problem has been around for so long. And of course, if you reduce it to the level of neurons firing, you go from mental things, cognition, down to just neural circuits and neural activity. Well, why stop there, right? Why not just keep going? There's more levels down. Why not just go down and down until you get to molecules, right? Down to cells and molecules and atoms and subatomic particles and quantum fields and all of that. And some people would say, well, look, it's your brain is just a bunch of atoms, and they're going to obey the laws of physics. What does it matter what you're thinking? That can't possibly have any effect on what happens in your brain. And I think that's a mistake. But again, it's not obvious.
Right.
It's not obvious why it's mistaken. And that's really where the rest of the work of the book is to point out how the whole system can have some causal power as an entity. Yeah, so that was the kind of laying out for myself the challenge that I was setting myself.
Hello, everybody. If you like the content of this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Also, you can send me a message at midlifeawareness.podcast@gmail.com. Let's spend a little bit of time here. You don't really need to go too deep into here because you can really go deep into this book on the biological side of it. But you made a quote in there about Darwin and the origin of species, and how you believe that Darwin didn't go back far enough. And I think you just kind of referenced that.
Hmm.
So, as a groundwork for this book, then, can you get into some of the stuff as far as the single cell um, organisms and how they might have the free will and things like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I was getting at with respect to Darwin is that he talks about the origin of species, but it's sort of like once you have living things, here's how they diversify, right?
Right.
And that's fine and that's all great. But what he didn't talk about was the origin of life itself.
Yeah.
And the reason I brought that up was to ask the question, what is life? What does that mean to be a living thing? Because I don't think we can understand these big questions of free will without understanding what it means to be a living thing. I think we have to ground the concepts I referred to earlier of purpose and meaning and value at that level. So we can think of a living being as really a very dynamic set of processes. Of a bunch in this case, it's usually just chemical reactions, right? Where the product of one chemical reaction is the substrate for another one, and there's a whole big network of them that all kind of reinforce each other, right? There's lots of feedback loops and so on. So it's a big self-contained set of reactions, of processes that keep themselves going. And they happen within some sort of enclosed space. Now, usually it's within a cell membrane. So it's like, imagine like a storm, but inside a bubble, right? Sort of like a storm in a bubble, and the storm keeps itself going. Now, the purpose of life, if you will, is to persist in the sense that when you have sets of reactions that are configured one way, they'll tend to be very stable and they'll keep going. And if they're configured a different way, or if they're perturbed, then maybe they'll stop persisting and we won't see them, right? And the ones that keep persisting, we call alive. And they have to do some work in physics terms, right? So they have to do some work to keep organized because in thermodynamics, there's this second law of thermodynamics, which is just the idea that things tend to get disorganized. If left by themselves, things tend to fall apart, which I think
Right.
is a pretty commonplace observation, right?
Right.
Ordered things require some explanation, and in this case, they require some work. So that our little living thing, a single cell with a membrane, has an inside and an outside, and inside it's trying to keep itself going. It needs some fuel, right? It needs
Right.
some energy in order to do that. So it has a challenge, right? So our little living thing to keep on going has to keep getting energy. Now, most of the time, these things get energy in the form of food. That is some chemicals that they bring inside them, and they strip electrons off them. That's where their energy comes from. So they either need to have a source of food that's just given to them. And some things live like that. They just sit where they are and let like ocean currents blow food by them. Most living things don't have that luxury. They have to go looking for it. And in fact, if they stay in one place too long, they use up all the food, so they have to move somewhere else. And then that brings into existence a different kind of causation that was never there in the world of non-living things. And that's a causation that's based on information. So not just physical forces pushing things around. So our little living cell, in order to move in a productive way, needs some information, like what's out in the world. Is there food over here? Is there something bad over there? It needs to know what's out there. So it has little sensors, little receptors that are just individual protein molecules. They sit on the actually, they span the cell membrane. And so the bit that sticks out is looking to bind to some, say, a sugar, right, that our bacterium can eat. And when that happens, there's no sort of transfer of energy or matter. There's a little wiggle. There's a little wiggle inside the cell of that same protein molecule, and that wiggle tells the cell, it's just information, tells the cell, hey, there's food over here, go that way, right? And that's the response that's configured into in this case, the biochemistry of the single cell. So what we can see there is that over time, if we have some, evolution, some variation that happens that changes the configuration of cells, then the ones that are configured in such a way that they tend to move towards the food will do better than the ones that aren't. And so evolution kind of packs in what we can call control policies into the organism. Basically, they're reasons. They're reasons for doing things. Now, of course, the bacterium is not thinking about anything.
Right.
It's not aware that it has reasons or that its behavior is goal directed, but it is, right? The information isn't neutral. It's about something in the world, but it's also valuable to the organism, right? It knows that it's a good thing relative to this purpose of persisting for it to go one way or another. So it has not just information, but meaning. And I think that's a perfectly naturalized way of thinking of meaning and value and purpose. We're cashing it out in very clear, concrete terms. Um, and hopefully, other biologists will see that we can talk about those things without it seeming like, some mystical woo, to use those terms. And once we start there, right? So what we'll have there is that already the basics of decision making. We have an organism. It has reasons for doing things. It's taking in information from the world, and then depending on its own state, it has a repertoire of actions. In this case, go this way or that way. And then it has to choose one of them, right? It can't do both at the same time. So it has to have some system inside it that effectively integrates a bunch of information in a context-dependent way, a holistic way, and then settle what's the best option, choose one of those, and execute that. But it's doing that like I said, it's the whole entity that's doing that. It's not just being pushed around by little isolated bits within it, because they're all talking to each other, right? They all have all these feedback loops and so on.
Right.
So you can't just reduce it to it being pushed around by its parts. And it's doing it for reasons that are the reasons of the whole thing, not the reasons of its parts, and parts don't have reasons. So for me, that naturalizes the concept of agency. It's a really basic agency. Really,
Yeah.
you could
Yeah.
call it a proto-agency, but it's there, and it's different from non-living stuff, right? You don't get this kind of thing in a rock. or a planet or an electron or something, right? So yeah, so that's where I start, and then the rest of the evolutionary train track is just seeing as you make more complicated things and they develop more elaborate means of getting information and integrating it and thinking about it, abstracting higher order patterns, thinking over longer time frames, you get more sophisticated cognition ultimately to the level of what you see in humans. But the basic blueprint of what's going on is the same.
One thing that I never really focused on, but you brought this up in the book on the evolutionary tract was meaning. Okay. Everything has a meaning, like you just said. I think we tend to forget that we as humans don't just have, we're not we're not the only ones or only things that have a meaning or a purpose or whatever. We have even a single cell organ. The whole idea of a single cell organism is to stay alive.
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
So that is the meaning for that single cells. Now, us, yeah, we're our part of our meaning is to stay alive, but part of our meaning also is to figure out how am I going to stay alive? What am I going to do when we get all these choices? And I get the layout with that was incredible for me to read. I really enjoyed that part of it. Um, I do get lost in a lot of the technical words and stuff like that. That's why I like the philosophy side of it. But it was incredible the way you laid that out. So thank you for that. We are talking with Kevin Mitchell and his book Free Agents: How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. And then so we're going to switch over now to the philosophy side. Um, in my opinion, um, I think one of the biggest problems that free will has, and the deterministic side that you would kind of talked about, but I think we need to go into determinism a little bit deeper,
Mm-hmm.
to really kind of get an idea. But one of the biggest problems that determinism has compared to free will is the morality issue.
Yeah.
So let's start with determinism, go into that a little bit, and then we'll hit the morality part of it.
Yeah, great. So determinism is a word that has multiple different meanings, and it can be applied at different levels. You could say, for example, that you are psychologically determined to do something in a given circumstance because you wanted to do it, right? That is a usage that people apply, and it gets confused when people are talking about determinism at the level of physics, and it's not always clear because they use the same word at which level they're talking about. They get mixed up. So I tried to separate different types of determinism, and the biggest one, the biggest challenge is what I'll call physical predeterminism. And the idea there is that the laws of physics that govern how subatomic particles, systems of particles evolve through time, are completely deterministic from moment to moment, such that if you knew right now in some closed bit of the universe or the whole universe, the position and the momentum and the charge and the spin and the whatever, all these physical parameters, all the particles in it, you could, submit them to some big computer program, and there would be one possible state in the next instant of time. Only one. There's one possible future right then, and there's one after that, and one and one and one. There's never any possibilities, right? It's just a single timeline from start to finish, from the Big Bang to me saying this sentence, is all just completely determined, right? So that is the starting point that a lot of the philosophical debates talk about, and then you get these two weird conclusions from that. You'll have people who either say, well, look, if that's true, then how could there be free will? There's no choices, there's no options, so obviously there's no free will. Uh, I agree with that. Except I don't agree with the premise,
Right,
right?
right.
If the premise were true, I think that conclusion follows. But if you do that, then you end up just denying the bedrock phenomenology of our existence, which is that we make choices all the time, right? So you're left with that's a weird conclusion to settle on. But there's another version which is called compatibilism, where people will accept the idea that there's only ever one future, but then they kind of construct what feels to me like a contrived apparatus to say, well, even if that's true, you can still be held morally responsible for what you did because you did it for your reasons, even if you didn't have a choice of acting them out. And to me, I just could never find that to be a coherent story. And so, but those are the two main positions in the philosophy of free will. And it's bizarre to me that that's how people proceed because physics doesn't say that physics is deterministic in that way, right? I mean, what we know of quantum physics and also classical physics, despite what some people might say, is that there's fundamental indeterminacy. So as the system evolves along, there isn't just one possible future. There's multiple possible futures. It's a probabilistic kind of equation, actually, that like what's called the Schrodinger equation, just plays out probabilistically. And when you actually want to ask, how does the system actually evolve? One of those probabilities will be the one that gets realized, but in apparently a random sort of choosing across them, right? Or a biased, constrained way. But so yeah, so physics, doesn't actually prove that there's only one possible future. I would say quite the opposite, in fact, which flips the script, right? So we can start rather than starting with this idea of a deterministic universe where we have to ask where's the freedom coming from. Instead, if you just say, well, look, no, that's not what physics says. Physics says there's all this indeterminacy. The future is radically open, right? The freedom comes for free. And then you have to ask a totally different question. Where does the control come from? Where does the will part come in, right? How the challenge for an organism, but its physical system, both within itself and out in the world, could evolve in lots of different ways, possibly. And what it has to do is constrain them so that what happens is what it wants to happen, right? That's what will is. You're willing the future to be what you want it to be. So yeah, so I think that's one of the big stumbling blocks in the philosophical literature that I just think we just have to shift away from that. And once you get away from it, you're on totally different ground, right? You're not tying yourself up in knots trying to justify moral responsibility in the absence of choice. That's just a weird position to be in. So, so I think we can get this naturalized view whereby the agent can be in charge. And the really important bit is that because the low level details are not completely determining what happens next, that gives some scope for the way that a system is organized to constrain how it proceeds, right? So that's you can imagine a football coach telling his players to run this defense or run this offense or whatever, and that top down constraint is constraining where the players go, and it gives the whole system some power that it didn't have before. Like if you ever watch kids playing pee-wee football and it's chaos, right? They can't do anything as a team because they're not constrained to do anything, right? So what living organisms do is they constrain their parts. They organize them in certain ways so that they have functionality, like our bacterium that has systems for detecting sugars outside and mounting an appropriate response to them, right? So it's the very indeterminacy at the lowest levels that allows the system, the higher levels of the system, to exert some causal power and some causal influence and settle what happens for the reasons of the whole organism. So that's the kind of, in my view, the escape hatch that gets us out of this worry about not just determinism, but reductionism, the idea that all the causes are down at the lowest levels. And even if some of them are undetermined, if they're random, that, some people would say, well, just randomness doesn't help you. That doesn't give you free will. And I agree, it doesn't. What it does is open the door. It just has to be, it's just a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition to allow organization to have some causal power and thereby to allow organisms to have causal efficacy as agents in the world.
Hello, everybody. If you like the content of this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Also, you can send me a message at midlifeawareness.podcast@gmail.com. A couple of the things I thought of when I was going through that section of the book. Number one, if our life is a predetermined machine, don't we really have the evolutionary or ethical requirement to make sure that bad or evil things don't happen? And where I'm coming at from there is you go through a certain, because of the way science has evolved through quantum, physics and quantum science and all that stuff. There are studies out there that show before we actually make a decision that there are all these processes that happen before that. It's like milliseconds.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like the body knows what decision you're going to make before you make the decision. And that is part of the problem I think you're coming up with is, well, if the body knows that, then it becomes this, predetermined machine type of thing.
Yeah.
So that's not really a morality issue. But if we know that's going to happen, then where is the ethical process here to say, okay, now we can prevent, whatever evil from happening?
Mm. So, well, I'll come back to the ethical moral bit. Let me just talk about those scientific studies,
Yeah,
because they're
for sure.
very well known, right? So many people would know this idea that neuroscience has shown that before you make a decision, your brain has made the decision for you, and it only tells you afterwards, right? And there were some studies by a guy named Benjamin Libet and colleagues that claim to show that. And there's a whole bunch of other studies more recently that show that they were just not interpreted in the right way. It's not that the studies were wrong, what they saw really happens, but they just misinterpreted what was going on. And in fact, it's a weird scenario. So the scenario in that experiment is that they get people come into a lab, and the setup is that they have to move their wrist. They have to flick their hand or flick a finger whenever the urge takes them, right? So explicitly, they have no reason to do it.
Hmm.
And actually, what happens in that scenario is that effectively you decide to let some of your subconscious brain processes make that decision for you because you don't care, right? There's
Right.
no reason to care. You have no reason to consciously even monitor that. It's just boring and stupid and trivial and capricious, basically. So what people do is they allow these systems in their brain that are they're basically accumulating randomness to come to a point where there's a threshold to just do something. Right? So what's really interesting is if you set up the experiment differently, where there is an outcome that the person cares about, where, for example, if you flick your left hand versus your right hand, some money goes to this charity that you really care about versus that one that you don't care about, then you don't see that link with this random thing that you only later become consciously aware of, right? So there's a big difference, and this is one thing that comes out of the neuroscience and the philosophy about it, is that people want there to be one answer. They want there to be, it's like, this is how we make decisions. If I see in this scenario that people are not aware of their reasons for doing something, then they're never aware of it. And that's just a fallacious reasoning, right? It doesn't have to be one thing all the time. Loads of our behavior we're not particularly consciously aware of. It's done automatically, it's habitual. That's great because we've spent loads of time learning what's a good thing to do in different scenarios, and we file that away in neuroscience speak, and let that drive habitual behavior in lots of scenarios that we're familiar with. And then ones that we're not familiar with, we have to think a bit more, right? We have to consciously deliberate about those. And we can move between those two modes of operation quite fluidly. It's not the case that we're always in one or always in the other. So yeah, there's not a one size fits all answer to cognition and deliberation. A lot of it is subconscious processing, which you might call it automatic, but I'd rather call it intuitive.
Okay.
Because it's not for no reason. It's still for your reasons that you've learned. You just don't need to expend conscious effort thinking about it. So you get some intuitive sort of cognition that goes on, and then you'll get some more deliberative overt conscious cognition that also happens. And that's how we can decide things. And that's how also, when it comes to moral responsibility, there's a sense in which we can be held responsible for what we do, in the sense that people might say, well, you shouldn't have done that, and you had bad reasons for doing it. In fact, those two things are usually tied up together, right?
Usually, yeah.
Yeah, it's not just that something happened that they'd rather didn't happen. It's that you had bad reasons for doing it, usually selfish reasons. So we have, a lot of our sort of moral framework is based around the idea that you should be able to control yourself. You should be pro-social. You should, all of our virtues of generosity and fairness and loyalty and so on, they're all about pro-social cooperation. And then a lot of the other ones like prudence and patience and temperance, they're about self-control, which is also pro-social in the sense that if I can't control myself and I'm acting on every urge that I have, that's not a very, that's basically antisocial behavior.
Right.
So yeah, I think we can go from the idea that we have some control over our own behavior to the foundations of morality as themselves an evolved set of dispositions that we share, which are required for cooperation and culture and society and civilization itself, basically, we just need to get along.
Yes, we do. That would go a long ways, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the quotes that I really loved in your book, and it was talking about the whole um, free will versus um, morality, responsibility issue, is that you said asking what kind of free will we want that helps us maintain our moral responsibility can become almost a theological exercise in motivated reasoning. It means that we are looking for a palatable answer instead of trying to get to the answer. What really is, it's coming from the question from the wrong end. It's picking an answer that we need to build to support it. Instead, we want to know what kind of free will we actually have. Can you kind of go into that a little bit, please?
Yeah. So I kind of referred obliquely to this idea earlier when I was talking about compatibilism, right? This
Yeah.
philosophical position that starts with the premise that determinism is true and then tries to build this kind of artifice whereby we could still be held responsible for things because stuff in our brain is really complicated, we're unpredictable, we're doing things for reasons and can be judged on the reasons even if we don't actually have a choice. And to me, the rationale for doing that is precisely to try to defend the idea not of free will but of moral responsibility. Right? That's what people are claiming is compatible with determinism, is moral responsibility. I think that yeah, the argument that I've just sort of described, you can see it ties itself up in knots. It's really
It does.
weird to even say that someone is doing something when there's only one possible future ever. There's no choices. There's no doing. There's just happenings, right? There's just
Right.
one line of happenings. It makes no sense to me to even have that discussion and use those terms anymore if you just accept this premise of determinism. And so, what I wanted to do was say, look, rather than doing that, let's see, biologically speaking, what kind of freedom we have and what kind of will organisms can exercise within that space of freedom. And really importantly, it also is not starting from the premise, a sort of a definition of free will that says if you don't have absolute freedom from any prior cause whatsoever that's impinging on your behavior, then you're not free, right? That to me is just a kind of an incoherent notion, right? What would that even mean for a living organism to do something without any prior causes, right? I mean, no evolution, no history of the organism, no learning from experience, no reasons, no goals. All of that is prior causes, right? It would be completely unmotivated, unreasoned, random behavior. And anything that did that would just not be alive, right? Life would never have evolved if that were how things proceeded. So again, I didn't want to start with that kind of foundation, that definition, because it's incoherent and unachievable. Instead, I wanted to say, well, let's just look, how many degrees of freedom do the organisms have? And of course, it's not infinite. It's
Right.
constrained, and those constraints are exactly what's keeping the thing alive, right? That's it. To be a self just is to constrain all your parts to keep being in the same organization through time. So again, it was trying, in a much more general point, to look at constraints as a type of cause, right? It's not just physical forces of things bouncing into each other. The way things are organized can be a part of the cause, but then also to see that constraints are the very thing that life is made of. So it's to get away from the idea that that they're bad, that they're restricting your freedom. They are your freedom. They're where your freedom comes from.
Well, let's dive a little bit into that a little bit more. Let's talk about the ability to think about our thoughts and reason about our reasons. You go into one of the prevailing thoughts in philosophy is Descartes' dualism.
Mm.
So, can you go into that a little bit? Explain what the dualism is and how that affects things here.
Yeah, so it comes a little bit from just what I was talking about there a minute ago about absolute free will, where the idea is that to get away from purely physical causation, Rene Descartes was a 16th century French philosopher, proposed this idea that there was a realm of physical stuff, but there was another realm of mental stuff and mental goings on, which then could somehow influence what happens. So you could be free in this mental realm to decide what to do, and then somehow that would affect the physical realm and actually institute those decisions. Now, the somehow is doing all the work in that picture, right? Okay, how is this mental stuff supposedly going to affect the physical stuff? And that idea of dualism still, I think, kind of infects a lot of thinking, even in neuroscience, right? So there's a sense that if neuroscience is showing the biology by which decision making happens, well, then it's not you doing it, right? Every time we learn a bit more about how the brain works, it's the brain doing it. And I just think that's a wrong way of thinking. It's a wrong conclusion that's caused by people still having this kind of a hang up that you should be like a little ghost in the machine, a little immaterial spirit or a little man inside, a little homunculus in here pulling the controls. Whereas, the picture that I wanted to come to was that you are the whole thing, right? You are this big dynamic entity. There's nothing more than that. It doesn't produce yourself as an extra thing. It embodies it entails yourself, right? And so, along with all the reasons for yourself and the ability to think about those reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So, over evolution, we talked about bacteria having reasons for doing things, but
Right.
those are reasons that evolution kind of packs into them. Right? But with the evolution of nervous systems, organisms gained the ability to learn from experience, right? So they could track things in the world, they could build a kind of a model of the world, they could come to understand relations between things, especially causal relations. They could learn from their own experience where, okay, I remember I was in this scenario before. Could have done A or B and I did A and it turned out great. I'm going to do A again, right? And that's how organisms come to develop habits from successful outcomes of their own actions. Or, of course, they could have done B and it might have been disastrous. And they would say, well, I'm not doing that again, right? So they in that sense, they develop their own reasons. So many, organisms will have reasons like that they've learned through their own experience. Now, what we get in humans is an extra kind of level of complexity that comes with our bigger brains and extra really levels of neural hierarchy, where at some point here you could have reasons for doing things where you're thinking about what's out in the world, you're thinking about what your current state is. Are you hungry? Are you tired? Are you afraid? What are your goals? And so on, right? And that's cognition, thinking about what to do. But there's another level that kind of looks down at those bits and said, you know what? I'm having a thought about what to do. I'm having a thought about this thing out in the world. I have a belief about that. But now you can ask, well, how confident am I? I heard a rustling in the grass. How scared should I be?
Mm-hmm.
Um, And so you can take other things into account and say, well, it's a windy day, so probably I shouldn't be too scared, right? So you can do this extra level of thinking about your thoughts and reasoning about your reasons that other organisms don't seem to be able to do. But that really frees us, right? It's the thing that gave us kind of escape velocity from just the rest of biology, where we have this now open-ended cognitive ability to think about all kinds of things over a time horizon that's effectively infinite, right? Unlike most animals where they can think about things right now, maybe a little bit ahead of time, but not usually not very far ahead of time. We can think about things, tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now, 1,000 years from now, whatever. So this sort of metacognition that we have really gives us an ability to transcend the immediate. We don't always have to be just goal directed in an impulsive kind of a fashion, right? We can think and plan over very complicated scenarios with tons of variables over a very long time frame, and that gives us some abilities that other animals don't have, and it's the reasons why we've been able to colonize the entire planet and live in
Right.
every conceivable environment you can think of.
Hello, everybody. If you like the content of this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Also, you can send me a message at midlifeawareness podcast@gmail.com. One of the quotes that I really like to listen to, you brought up in this session here, and that was Lao Tzu. And it goes like this: watch your actions, they become habits. Watch your habits, they become character. Watch your character, becomes your destiny.
Yeah.
And a lot of that now leads into, you go towards the end of the book, you go towards the process philosophy. So a lot of this is leading up to processes that happen over our time.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the stories that you tell here that I really clung to was the story about uh, drinking tea. Okay, you get an idea that you're thirsty, you want to drink a tea, right? We think the goal is the tea. We think the goal is drinking the tea at the end, when actually the goal starts way before that. So can you go into more of the process philosophy with that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that idea of thinking of processes is really key, and it's a change. A lot of science thinks about substances, thinks about objects, and doesn't necessarily think about them through time. So living beings are sets of processes with continuity through time. That's what it means to be an alive thing. So I think that's a really key outlook. And if we talked earlier about our bacterium that's trying to keep itself together. It's literally trying to prevent itself becoming one with the universe, right? It's trying to stay organized like this as this set of processes is doing work to keep itself like that through time. And all living organisms have to do that with their physical organization, but we also do it with our psychology, right? Our character, being us, continuing to be the same person through time, involves this kind of dance, a balance between stasis, right? Maintaining the same set of sort of psychological dispositions and attitudes and beliefs and so on, with the possibility of change. And the possibility of change is what you referred to there when you were talking about habits becoming character, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, over time, we we have to be able to learn and adapt to things while still being the same person through time. So it's sort of a great balancing act. And one of the really interesting elements, I think, is that when we think about our psychology, we can trace a trajectory. Again, it's not a static thing. We can trace a trajectory of how that emerges through our life. And it does start with innate predispositions that we all have from our genetics, from the way our brain developed, which may wire up different circuits in our brains slightly differently. So that, I referred earlier to the idea of risk aversion, that one person might be more or less risk averse they might never be able to do anything about that, right? That's a very fundamental, foundational sort of parameter that's tuned in their brain a certain way that will inform the way that they go about living their life. But I want to argue against the idea that it's proximally controlling what they do moment by moment, right? It's just too general a thing to be able to do that. Instead, it informs the way that they adapt to the world. And that's a very much an active interaction with the world. It's not just experiences happen to us and they shape us and we're just passively molded by what happens. That's not true at all. We're actively choosing our environments. Someone who's naturally risk averse will just not choose to put themselves in risky environments all the time, right? So they'll come to kind of come to an understanding with the world, right? Build an accommodation with it in a sense that where they're most comfortable with it because they seek out environments, they create environments, they everything that we do in the world is leading to some of the new experiences that we're going to have. They're not just things that happen to us. They're things that we choose and construct. And as we do that, we build these characteristic adaptations, ways of behaving in the world that come to define us, right? They're not just these very basic predispositions, they're habits, they're policies, they're ways of behaving, and they become character traits, really. And so one question is, how much control do we have over that process? How much can we consciously decide I'm going to be the type of person who does this, or I'm not going to be the type of person who does that? I'm going to have a kind of a meta policy of being an honest person, generally speaking. And then if I find somebody's wallet on the street, I'm going to hand it in, because I've decided to be that type of person just in general. So those are really, really interesting questions, I think, about how character emerges. Really, what I wanted to do was just highlight the fact that we're not driven by these tunings like a robot, that we have some say in that process of how our character emerges. We're not passive in that. And that ultimately, especially our capacity for reasoning about our reasons means that we have some control over our commitments and our attitudes and our dispositions and policies and some responsibility for them. And and I think that's in a sense there's a meta responsibility, right? It's not just responsible for the action that you did, it's responsibility for having the character that led to that action, right? For having bad reason. And that's where I think people I think we can still have a scientific view of morality in that sense by understanding that agents themselves, human beings themselves as persons, are involved in how they're configured. Right? That's not just things that happen to us. Some of the way I am now, a lot of the way I am now, is because of the choices that I have made through my life. And that for me is a way to ground a perfectly reasonable kind of moral responsibility that at the same time, doesn't deny the fact that for many people, they may be configured in a way, constituted in such a way that, for example, they're more impulsive. And that may be just kind of the way that they are. And they may have had to, try to not be that way. And it doesn't deny the fact that, for example, things like drug addiction or food addiction or other kinds of compulsions really do constrain our ability to control our own actions. Right? So by grounding all of that in the real biology, right, not this mystical thing, I think it gives a more realistic perspective on responsibility, where you can take those things into account without reducing everything to that level and eliminating the person as an agent.
You begin the book with talking about machines. You also end the book with talking about machines. And I think you know where I'm going with this one, but we're in a time right now, a time frame right now where artificial intelligence, AI, basically, is becoming a big thing that we, as a society or whatever you want to say, are going to have to contend with. Two questions on that. Number one, do you feel like this is the next evolutionary step? And do you have any concerns as far as the AI? What would they be, or just general thoughts on the AI
Yeah,
issue?
yeah. I mean, it's such a huge area right now. We're all massively impressed by these large language models like ChatGPT and the other models that can make images, and now they're putting them together, um, and they really, really have amazing, amazing capabilities that are very, very impressive. And I think there's a question of whether these things understand anything. They give
Right.
an impression
Right.
of understanding things, but really, you could argue that what they're doing is, these language models, they're just predicting what would be a reasonable thing to say as a next word in a sentence, and they construct things based on having heard all the sentences that anyone has ever written on the internet, effectively, right?
Yeah.
So because they're trained on that corpus of data, they their whole point is to use that to make a plausible sounding utterance. It doesn't mean that they understand anything, because I don't think they're the kind of thing that could have understanding. Um, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't build something with an architecture that understands things. And I think to do that, that actually we might need a really different architecture. We might need an architecture that's more based on these kinds of control systems that we've been talking about, whereby entities can have reasons to do things, and based on their goals, they can develop an understanding of the world that better allows them to navigate through it to achieve their goals, whatever they are. So if we built a system that was kind of embodied, that was engaged in the world, that was able to causally intervene in the world and not just passively receive data, but actively go out and get it, for some, to foster some goal, then I think we might get real general, what's called general intelligence. So not just the ability to do some very narrow task really well, like play chess or tell us the next word in a sentence, but the ability to use cognitive processes to solve problems for the entity, right? To navigate successfully in the world, basically. Now, I think that we could look to nature, if we wanted to build something like that, to see what are the design principles, what's the architecture we'd have to build. And in fact, what I described in the book is basically how nature did that, right? All of these elements that you
Right.
need to build, these sensors and cognitive apparatus and decision-making machinery and so on. The really, really big question is, should we do that, right? What would it do? Should we build an artificial entity? Should we build not just artificial intelligence, but an intelligence, right? It would be a being.
Right.
And I don't think that's, in the near future going to happen, but there's no reason in principle why it couldn't. I don't see any reason that says, look, only squishy, wet biological stuff can do these things. I think we could instantiate it in a robot or in a virtual being in a simulated environment. But then, yeah, there's all kinds of ethical questions about what status would that kind of thing have, and who would be responsible for it, and would it be responsible for anything? Would it care about anything? Would we have given it the capacity to care about anything? I think all of those are very interesting questions. They're science fiction-y at the moment,
Right.
but they could be science fact-y pretty soon. So probably time to start thinking about them. Yeah, I mean, it's super, super interesting, scary. Um, I think there's all sorts of ethical questions around AI that are very current, and then there's these ones that are these sort of possible scenarios that we can also think about. I think it's important not to lose sight of the current ones when we're thinking about the science fiction-y scenarios as well.
Yeah, because that gets into just a rabbit trail, really. Because then, if you're talking about AI as being the next step in the evolutionary process, well, who's in charge of making that, right?
Yeah. And
So
I mean,
it's
yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, I realized I didn't answer that bit of the question. Um, I don't think it's the next step, yeah, in the evolutionary process.
right.
However, well, I mean, it's possible that we could construct a life form, an artificial life form that is new. Um, I guess maybe you could call that the evolutionary process in that it evolved from the thinking of us, right? So maybe that's fair enough. Um, it's not going to be our next step, right? If we it'll be a new thing if we do that. And yeah, we should be careful.
Yeah, I think I just stumped you. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, Kevin Mitchell, I really thank you. On our way out here today, here's an opportunity for you to say anything right now that you think is pertinent that we didn't really talk to about in this session. Again, the book is great. I hope people go out and get it because it's very deep, not only on the philosophical side, but on the biological side. And um, in my opinion, I think it has a lot of good thinking processes, a lot of right thinking processes on it. I just enjoyed it coming from the evolutionary background because, like it or not, most of the time when we're talking about free will, we're talking about a religious background type of
Hmm.
thing. And it is nice to see it coming from the science background too.
Yeah.
So on your way out, why don't you just tell me, is there anything in this book that you want to reiterate at this point or talk about at
Um,
this point, and then how on the back end of that, how can people learn about you? How can people see your books and all that stuff? So give us all that
okay.
information.
Well, first of all, let me say thanks very much for your
Oh,
kind
thank
words about
you.
the book. I really appreciate it. And, I hope that while it is, there's a lot of science in there, I hope that it's accessible. The point was that, it shouldn't, you don't have to have a specialist knowledge, I hope, for it to be understandable. The gist of it, at least, maybe
Yeah,
there's some details that will be challenging. I'm not, it's not easy sailing in every part, let's say, but I
right,
but I
right,
hope it's
right.
understandable, right?
Yes.
The one thing I want to say, I guess, is that so I'm not religious myself, but I was brought up Catholic actually, and so there is there's this idea of a soul, right? Or a soul, or a self, or a mind, or spirit, all of those ideas which sound very non-scientific. And I guess the sort of one of the themes of the book is actually that we can have a scientific study, we can have a science of selves and subjects, right? And not everything has to be just reducible to physics and so on, right? Minds are real, thinking has real power. We don't have to just eliminate cognition and bring it down to the level of neural firings. We don't have to eliminate organisms and say that they're just collections of physical atoms, right? A self, living things are selves. That's what they are. They have causal power as selves, as entities, as persons in the case of humans through time. And so for me, while it's not a religious or theological view of the soul, I think it's still a kind of a spiritual view almost of selves, right? And I think we can't, we I want to resist this mechanistic reduction that I think we get from a lot of science, and especially from a lot of neuroscience these days. So yeah, I think we can have a more holistic view of things that doesn't go off into into mysticism, that's perfectly scientific, but just not reducible to just mechanism. So yeah, so that I think is a theme that may resonate with people from
Yeah,
lots of
it does.
backgrounds.
It really does. I thought you did a really good job of laying that out. I really did.
Thanks.
So
And
on your way out now, just go ahead and give us a website or any kind
yeah,
of information that you
sure.
want to give out there.
Yeah, great. So I have a website called www.kjmitchell.com, and I'm on Twitter at Wiring the Brain, and I have a blog which is also called the Wiring the Brain blog. So people can find me that way, or they can just Google me and free will or brains or something like that. You probably come up with me, as opposed to say the Kevin Mitchell, who was the all-star for the San Francisco Giants in the 1980s. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
not hard to find.
It's funny you say that because I was in a conversation with somebody and was asking if they had ever heard you, and he goes, "Are you talking about the baseball player?" And I said, "Man, I completely forgot about him.
He was
That was a
good. He was
while
good.
ago."
It was a while ago. Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, Kevin Mitchell, thank you so much for coming by.
Okay.
Again, I really enjoyed the book. I enjoyed the time here. Thank you for giving up some time out there in Dublin, Ireland. I know it's late in the afternoon out there on a Friday for you, so I really do appreciate it. The book is called Free Agent: How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. I encourage everybody to go out and get it. It is a very, very deep and good read, and I think it's got a lot of good points in it. So thank you so much, Kevin, and I
Thanks a
hope
lot.
things go well for you in the future.
Thanks, Dennis. For you too. Thanks. Bye.